welcome back, Ted.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for joining me today. So I'm just wondering, you've been traveling to so many countries, right? So how many countries have you been to?
Oh gosh, I stopped counting.
Yeah, so
a lot.
Dozens,
a lot, yeah.
right? Dozens, right?
Yep.
So have you always wanted to travel to a different foreign countries when you were a kid?
Oh, always. I had,
Always?
I'm part of a group in New York City called the Explorers Club. That's 3,800 members around the world, and their one thing in common is curiosity.
Right.
And so they do a lot of traveling. They go on expeditions,
Yeah.
all sorts of things. And I'm definitely in that camp. I also refer to myself as having been born with an ocean gene.
Oh, ocean gene.
That means in particular I can't walk past a body of water without jumping in or splashing or doing something. So
Right.
I've always wanted to go other places. To your point, interesting over time to start putting a business overlay
Yes.
on that
Yes.
because it gives you a little bit of a foundation and a framework to think about different cultures because they are so different from each other. And now there's the whole question about where is globalization?
Yes.
And to me, it's pretty straightforward. Whatever might happen over a certain period of time or between or among certain countries, the globalization thing it's so bound into all of our lives and our governments and our social systems that I think it's here to stay and only deepening over time.
Right. So we talk about global connectedness. So I mean, there are a lot of things that we are so connected, right? So today you can travel, you can fly, go to see the tourist, right? So go to different places to have fun, eat the food, enjoy the culture, right? But also there are some digital connectedness. So you can watch foreign movies, right? So you can watch a lot of reality shows, right? So there are so many different aspects about, globalization, international connectedness, right?
Yep.
So why is that important? Or is that important? Why should students embrace this international or global mindset?
Yeah, well, it's a great question, and I would, just having been in business for a pretty long time, I would encourage people if they see some version of a posting, if they're from the U.S. or if they're headed towards the U.S. for a long period of time, if you find a posting someplace else, seriously consider it because it just gives you a different perspective. I didn't directly spend time during my Wall Street career abroad, but I was responsible for different elements in different places. So we traveled to Asia and Europe quite a bit, and I would come back every single time and felt like I had a deeper perspective. Always gradual, like, now I have a perspective, and then a month later, now I have a perspective.
Right.
And so you learn that you never really have the full perspective you want, but you keep chipping at it. But I do think time abroad, even if it's summer programs or any opportunity to get into another culture as immersively as possible is a great long-term experience to have.
Right. So in classroom, we talk about, country differences. So we will say there are, two dimensions. One is formal institutions like laws, regulations, and then the other one is informal. It's more like culture, social norm, conventions, right? So during your time abroad, have you ever run into a situation that you find, oh my God, the laws and regulations are so different? Do you have a story to share?
I mean, it would be hard to pick just one because there is, if you develop, say it's a financial product and you develop it in one place, and then you say, well, here's a really good idea, let's take it to another place. Right. There could be all kinds of cultural differences that would make that not acceptable or something that just wouldn't happen.
Right.
There are larger examples like the bundling of services. If you look at the way the US is constructed with banking versus communications versus social networks,
yes,
as very different from a lot of Asia as an example.
Right.
So there's a lot of ways that you can trip up on things. So we've had over time, or I should say, been involved in things that we thought would work other places, but aren't just of interest. So there's that cultural overlay and the social license to operate. All those things are important and can be very regional. There's some things that are more broadly, dispersed, but a lot of things are pretty peculiar to a particular geography.
Right. Do you remember one culture shock you ever had in a foreign country?
Oh, that's a great question. I would say that probably going to some of the more remote places in the Pacific.
Yeah.
Just because it's just so different, and it starts off by, really taking a long time to get there. And so it makes you reflective. But then you look at, people are showing that view of the Google Earth now where you can rotate it. And if you focus on the Pacific, it's all ocean,
Right.
the entire frame.
Right.
And so thinking about these cultures and communities that are all, thriving, also facing some challenges with climate change and other things, but it's visiting those, they're so different
Right.
from the experience. I live in New York City.
Yes.
And so every time I go
Right.
someplace like that,
Right.
it's a real
Right.
eye-opener.
Right. I mean, New York City is super diversified, right? So we got the diversity. You can arguably, New York City has one of the most authentic Chinese restaurant, right? The Little Italy, so it's very diverse, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so even for you, coming from New York City, you go to other countries, you still find some differences, seems like.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Yeah. I would say that from when I was traveling around as a college student, back then, you wouldn't go to whatever, Amsterdam and see a Starbucks and McDonald's
Yep.
and all those things.
Yep.
You really didn't.
Yes.
So there had that brand globalization.
Yes.
And to your earlier point about communications and the things we watch and
Yep.
where do they watch Bridgerton
Yes.
and where do they
Yes.
use iPhones?
Yes.
iPhones is an incredible,
Yes.
sort of gets everybody thinking a certain way. And
Yeah.
so a lot of those things are pulling habits and socialization closer. And so
Right.
I would say it's different. That has definitely evolved over time to be, I don't want to say homogenized, but more sort of common threads that travel more broadly.
Right. Yeah, you mentioned a very interesting point is homogenization.
Yeah.
So something we talk about, because particularly the influence from the U.S., right? So you will see Starbucks across the globe, right? And then early days we call it McDonaldization. So it's almost like globalization drives by many of the U.S. restaurant franchising restaurants like McDonald's, KFC, right? Young brand, so they went abroad. So this drives globalization, so makes us more convergent.
Yep.
So it becomes more similar, right?
Yep.
But today, people start to really appreciate authenticity. When
Yeah.
you go to abroad, you really want to really to experience what is the most authentic experience in
Yep.
those countries. So what's your view about that? We see, on the one hand, we see,
Yeah.
convergence, so we become similar, we all speak English, right? So we all eat the same food, watch the same Hollywood movie. On the other hand, our taste become better, and then we really want some authentic foreign products or service.
Yeah.
Yeah.
More great questions. I think that as if you're in the U.S. as an example, and you have an idea and you're trying to export it to different places, I think a certain humility and respect, or they call it social license, and where you operate is critical. So an example would be sequestration, carbon sequestration. Is an amazingly hot topic right now. There's a lot going on in the terrestrial world with forests and so on. But there's a lot going on in the ocean too, and the idea of blue carbon
Oh yeah.
that comes from mangroves or seaweed or seagrasses.
Yes.
And mangroves are probably the most advanced as a method that people are pursuing. But then you think about it, so big multinational corporations say we're going to be net zero by whatever year they picked. So we're going to buy those credits.
Right.
So all of a sudden everyone says, wow, there's a bid for blue carbon. And so all the people who are rating it and packaging it and evaluating it, that industry is in formation. It's already there, but it's growing quickly to accommodate. So what's the piece that you really got to make sure you get right is the piece where you're actually growing those things.
Right.
And how do you come up with fair ways to build these projects at scale so it's enough to make a difference, but still, back to your stakeholder question, have benefits be fairly distributed.
Right.
And also create relationships locally that are durable and genuine.
Right.
Because if you take all this time to set up mangrove plantings for blue carbon, and then you don't have a strong local base community that owns that and is excited about it,
Right.
so it can survive through whether
Right.
it's actual storms or political storms or whatever it is, if that all washes away, you're nowhere. So
Right.
I think it's as we bring great ideas, what we
Yes.
think are great ideas, to other parts of the world, I think we have to be very sensitive to make sure that they're structured in a way that are just, equitable, gender balance, everything we can possibly do, because if they're not constructed that way, they may not be built to last.
Yes, I like you use social license. So it's basically kind of like the legitimacy, social proof from the local community, the endorsement for a big foreign companies coming in to operate, right?
Yeah. It's the same thing, by the way, in a multilateral, like I was in a finance organization and we were US based, but we had operations other places. And we used to call it life on the matrix.
Yes.
It's challenging because even if you're, let's say you're based in New York, but you have London and other offices there, you have to think about, you want it to feel local and respect, as we've been talking about, all the habits and customs and mores of the place you're operating in. Right. So that points you towards a certain way to operate. But that may not be exactly the way you operate in the US. So what do you do with that? That dissonance there? Right. And how do you balance it? And I don't think, in my experience, it wasn't a right answer, but you definitely had to keep an eye on both.
Right.
If it got too local and too separated from the core mission of a global organization, that might not be a good thing for stakeholders.
Yes.
But on the other hand, if you just homogenize it, as we've been talking about in different contexts, that probably won't really grow and be adapted and thrive over time.
Right. What you describe is a classic framework we use in classes, the tension between global standardization or integration versus local responsiveness and localization. So I think all multinationals, they face this tension. To what extent I want to be standardized across all the different countries? To what extent I really want to go local, right? So there's optimal distinctiveness, optimal level for them if they can reach to that level.
And by the way, that might vary by industry or by individual company, right? Depending on what the product is, depending on any number of things.
Right.
You could imagine that there's not an exact right answer, but there are sort of bounds or guardrails of don't go too far either way, or you'll be in peril.
Right. So knowing how to do that, it needs a lot of experiences, probably a lot of tries and errors. So, but for students who study international business from the very beginning, so they know, okay, those are the potential barriers and those are the potential enablers, will probably help them to have this right mindset when they design and execute the strategy.
Absolutely. I think you put that perfectly.